Okay, colleagues, so let's kick the day off by doing something useful. See, can't sleep at night, have to think about Hegel. Um, and what I wanted to do is to read several sections from the Continuum Hegel Dictionary. Um, just a few words about the publishing house. So it's by G.A. Magee. It's a different Magee. Just one word about the publishing house. So Continuum is less well-known and less respected academic publishing house. It's not Palgrave or Routledge, for example. But I still like one has to be careful when we're looking at um, texts from Continuum, but still, with enough care, they're good. So there are 4 articles. This is the Hegel Dictionary. I find it very useful in all sorts of ways, useful and interesting. There are 4 articles I want to look at. So the first one is I want to do it the following way. I want to start with abstract right, then morality, then ethical life, and then look at the article on the philosophy of right in general. Now, this is the wrong order. One should begin with philosophy of right. However, we talked so much about the basics and the generals. I want to jump straight into the heart of the issue and to show you that it's worth reading through. Anyway, so we begin here. So abstract right, das abstrakte Recht. Hegel's philosophy of right is divided into 3 major sections: abstract right, morality, and ethical life. This is an important division. People should know this. These represent the principal dialectical moments in which the idea of right, meaning roughly justice, or the right in the sense of right and wrong. Now, this is interesting. So he's saying that the principal dialectical moments in which the idea of justice, of right meaning roughly justice, develops itself, culminating in a fully adequate theory. So abstract right, morality, and ethical life are 3 conceptual steps, 3 conceptual stages on the development of the full idea of justice, if you want. Now, we haven't used the word justice very much with respect to Hegel, but I think, perceptive students should be aware that sort of the whole idea of the philosophy of right is to get at some sort of a full conception of justice. Let's continue. So at the same time, Hegel tells us that these sections display the human will coming to determine itself in more and more adequate form. So this is, if you want, again, these 3 moments, abstract right, morality, ethical life, are the 3 stages of the development of justice, but also 3 stages of the development of human will, or actually human freedom. And again, you feel free to disagree with Hegel's conception of freedom, but some people will have accused Hegel of being actually totalitarian, hiding behind some sort of facade. But I personally, I find Hegel's picture deeply compelling. He is interested in freedom first and foremost, but freedom has certain conditions. Freedom has certain determinations. Freedom is not simple childish arbitrariness. In order to be really free, sort of the proper meaning of the word freedom is actually the right kind of determination, if you want. And notice, this is exactly what we see here. Human will coming to determine itself in more and more adequate forms. So adequate human freedom. Not childish freedom, not animal freedom, but adequate human freedom, which is a right kind of determination. Let me continue. On one level, abstract right encapsulates the... Now, this is interesting. This is, maybe we have seen this in other texts, but honestly, this is the first text in which they put this with so much straightforwardness. So I hope they're right, probably are, but I would be happy if we could find a corroboration, for example, in Boucher. This possibly is in Boucher. Anyway, in an article by Alan Patton, on one level, abstract right encapsulates the view of right typically held by Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke. Right consists in respect for persons as possessors of property. The most primal way in which human beings express their will or make it objective is through claiming that this or that is mine. Accordingly, in abstract right, the basic way in which individuals relate to one another is through the exchange of property. So doesn't this remind us of bürgerliche Gesellschaft, civil society, narrowly defined? And I think, in some deep sense, yeah, abstract right is civil society without the corporations. It's important because developed civil society, bürgerliche Gesellschaft, has corporations, but here no. I think the German word for corporation is Stand, but that's not really important. The concept, and by the way, feel free to look up in the dictionary. I'm sure they have an article on corporations as well. Anyway, The concept of personhood, typical of abstract right, is frequently described today as atomistic individualism. Further, the sort of community that characterizes abstract right is an impoverished one. Relationships between individuals basically fall into two categories: relationships of trade and competition, and intimate or familial relationships. Now, that's interesting. The implication of this is that outside of families, there is nothing that binds people together. There's really nothing that binds people together. Outside of families, there's really nothing that binds people together. That creates solidarity other than self-interest. So, nothing other than self-interest that binds people together. Yeah, this exactly sounds like this description of, again, civil society narrowly construed or misconstrued, as I have been talking about. Again, without the allegiance to a whole greater than your own, for example, which is the corporation. So if you are, quote unquote, a patriot of your corporation, if you have fellow feelings towards corporation, that's already, you're going beyond this abstract right. In the abstract right, there are no corporations. It's only familial feeling and self-interest. And the familial feeling is also a kind of emotion. Think back to Hobbes. Hobbes uses this phrase, natural laws. Anyway, as a result, under abstract right, any kind of overarching social authority or institutions are conceived simply as contrivances serving self-interest. This is exactly this, contemporary economist idea of trying to explain society completely through appeal to self-interest, which I personally, as a social theorist, I think fails miserably. And Hegel shows us some of the ways in which it fails, but that's my opinion. And Hegel's opinion, you don't have to agree. Society under abstract right is viewed as founded upon a contract, social contract, and as something created merely for our convenience to facilitate trade and to protect our rights. Authority in society exists simply to make it easier for individuals to do whatever they want, so long as what they want does not interfere with someone else's rights. Hegel opposes the social contract theory of Hobbes and Locke. He rejects the idea that society is something individuals have freely created. If this were true, we would probably feel that the state is something we have power over since it's our creation, and that we could, if we desired, simply opt out or change the rules at our pleasure. But Hegel says that this cannot be how things are. After all, the state sends men off to fight and die for it. Now, this is a strange way of arguing, and I think on the first reading it should sound wrong what Magee is saying here. This sounds like a wrong kind of line of reasoning, but let's flip it the other way around. We know that fighting and dying for the state, sometimes at least, is a necessity of politics, and this means this already shows one limitation of this purely social contract idea. Doesn't this remind us of something like the fool's problem, for example, in Hobbes? And this idea that you can, standard social contract theory cannot solve the free rider problem. Likewise, contemporary neoclassical economics cannot solve the free rider problem. Yeah, I think there's something to it. The power of the state and the needs of society transcend my individual self-interest. Obviously, it is not in my self-interest to die. Yet, when I'm called to serve society, even at the risk of my own life, I feel that I have a duty to do so. We can thus see that from Hegel's perspective, the way in which abstract right conceives of the relation of the individual to society is defective. So abstract right in itself is abstract, meaning it's partial, one-sided, defective. And he argues that we must transcend this standpoint in favor of a more adequate one. However, the dialectical mechanism for doing so is revealed through the nature of wrong. This is also another interesting idea of thinking about how crime and punishment and how the legal procedure, what Magee is going to talk about in a second, also seems to go back this narrow, selfish, self-interested conception. It seems that when we come to serve in a court of law, think back of maybe Rousseau's general will, it's not the same thing as simply some kind of an exchange for the benefit of self-interest. There's more involved than simple self-interest, like justice, for example. Anyway, Hegel's discussion of wrong deals with the way in which transgressions against right appear and how they are dealt with in the system of abstract right. Again, this system is based upon self-interest and on the right of person to be let alone, so-called negative rights. Such persons make contracts with each other, and human nature being what it is, there are bound to be individuals who choose to break the rules. The most important sort of wrong that Hegel talks about is crime, which, as he conceives it, always involves some form of coercion. When we coerce another individual, Hegel says that we commit a kind of fundamental contradiction. We see ourselves as persons with rights and freedoms, and normally we see others similarly. Yet, when we coerce others, we behave as if we no longer recognize the nature we share in common with them. We no longer recognize them as rights-bearing individuals. Coercion is thus a kind of denial of reality, a willful denial of the nature of other human beings. Hegel sees crime and coercion as purely negative and destructive. Notice, Hegel sees crime and coercion as purely negative and destructive. And this element of abstract right is retained in the Rechtsstaat, throughout the stages. So crime and coercion, including state coercion, is, I think, for Hegel, always unlawful in some sense. Now, coercion is not the same thing as punishment. We'll talk about this in a second, but coercion, pure and simple, is a bad thing for Hegel. So there is an important, although limited, but an important place for negative rights in Hegel. In recognizing this, however, we are pointed towards something positive, a universal principle of right or justice itself. Now, this goes beyond abstract right. So universal principle of right or justice itself goes beyond abstract right. In seeing certain actions as wrong, as purely negative, in need of putting right, we recognize, in fact, that there is a right, not just self-interest. A right, not just self-interest. Again, think of a judge or a jury who try to, come to the conclusion in the case of asking themselves, what is their interest in the case? That's not justice. That's not the way we see justice normally. Anyway, further, we sense, however, dimly that the character of this principle of right is universal. In other words, that it applies to everyone, and that criminal has transgressed this. As we see or soon see that the criminal's actions require punishment. In fact, Hegel's treatment of punishment is one of the most controversial portions of the philosophy of right. In a nutshell, Hegel argues that when we punish criminals, we are in fact honoring their rational human nature. Say hi to Rousseau. Exactly. It's forcing to be free. When we punish criminals, we are in fact honoring their rational human nature. The reason for this, quite simply, is that punishing criminals, in punishing criminals, we do to them what they themselves will if they were in fact capable of seeing that the crime is a wrong which has to be righted. Again, very analogous, I think, to Rousseau's general law and this notion of forcing to be free. Still, punishing wrongdoers in the name of right requires impartial judges able to set aside their individual interests or circumstances and to judge according to universal principles. Impartial judges, not just mere selfish self-interest. In the world of abstract right, however, we concern ourselves with rules for purely selfish reasons. Hegel therefore argues that abstract right cannot be self-sufficient because its self-maintenance requires a kind of a partiality which it does not itself engender. Indeed, what is required is a moral standpoint. So we have to move on to the moral standpoint. And again, let me reiterate, Hobbes also talks about impartiality as an important element of the laws of nature. The judges should be impartial. And at the end of the day, Hobbes thinks this serves the interest of security. But in Hobbes, who tries to build the system purely on self-interest, all of this ends out, is driven against the wall of the fool's problem. Because one judge taking one bribe does not immediately lead to war of all against all. And so people will be tempted. And again, does Hobbes have a solution to the fool's problem? For Hegel, no, he does not. And I think Hegel's criticism should be taken seriously. The world of abstract right provides no guidance at all on how to determine what the principles of ethics are or how to apply them. So abstract right does not provide guidance, moral guidance. Abstract right is all about freedom of choice. Indeed, such freedom and the rights that go with it are exalted in society that exhibit its bare form of abstract right. Beyond telling us to not interfere with other people's pursuit of happiness, abstract right provides us no guidance in making ethical choices. We are free to be as I think this is very important. So the fact that you have a right does not mean that it's all right to do it. Let me repeat that. The fact that you have a right does not mean that it's all right to do it. We are free to be as piggish and immoderate, as uncultivated and unreliable, as rude and unkind as we like, so long as we recognize that freedom of others the freedom of others to be similarly debased. In short, the system of abstract right is morally empty. The dialectic therefore passes beyond the abstract right, right considered in its purely external or objective manifestation, to morality, which treats rights as it develops itself in the subjective inner life of the individual. These two moments, the objective and the subjective sides of right, will be reconciled in ethical life. Notice, Hegel calls, or at least G.A. Magee calls, abstract right the objective and morality the subjective sides of right. Complications, yes. See also, enlightenment, ethical life, morality, objective spirit, philosophy, right, punishment, or wrong. Okay. This actually took slightly longer than I planned. So I did not want to make a long video. So let me maybe just briefly, and I did not want to make a separate PDF in order to sort of show you that it's easy and to sort of search for these things in the text. So this is ethical life. Yeah. So morality. I don't want to read this because I wanted to keep this under 20 minutes. So, but it's probably not going to happen. But still. So again, he gives the summary. So because this is a dictionary, right? So in the philosophy, right, Hegel's discussion of morality, term that's used in a special technical sense, follows his discussion of abstract right, which is essentially the classical liberal view of society is founded upon a contract existing for the narrowly conceived self-interest of individuals. Wonderful sentence, absolutely wonderful sentence. So Hegel argues that the world of abstract right cannot maintain itself unless individuals are able to adopt the standpoint of impartiality, in fact, a moral standpoint. Blah, blah, blah. In short, the system of abstract right is morally empty. And here he talks about how morality is a subjective principle, how individuals look within themselves for moral guidance. And he talks about Kant, and he talks about this: consider whether your maxim can be asserted as a universal principle, Kant's categorical imperative. And then he says that, in fact, there's nothing, he says, a clever enough person can universalize anything he'd like to get away with. So he says Kant is onto something, but Kantian picture is incomplete, because if you're clever enough, you can make the categorical imperative work in such a way that you can justify whatever you want. This means that moral standpoint can quite easily become the standpoint of pure evil. And Kant actually talks about something like this, although Kant thinks it's impossible for a human being. Anyway, the standpoint of pure evil, that the individual setting himself up as the absolute. So basically, this clever self-consciousness is capable of making the moral standpoint into principle into either universal in and for itself, or the arbitrariness of its own particularity, which is going to be evil. So yeah. So we need to move beyond that. So moral, in some sense, again, the point is that human beings cannot, by their own mind, decide what is right and what is wrong. They have some guidance as to sort of this inner feeling provides a certain guidance. It's not useless, but it's incomplete without the laws of actually existing societies. So let's now move on to ethical life. So ethical life is the third major division of Hegel's philosophies. Following the abstract right and morality, this section depicts the self-development of the idea of right and human will. Morality is a response to the moral bankruptcy of abstract right, and morality looks to inner subjectivity, for example, conscience, for ethical guidance. Hegel argues, however, that morality, so understood, is fundamentally empty and cannot generate principles we experience as truly binding upon us. Ethical life represents Hegel's account of how ethics is in fact grounded not in abstract principle, but in social institutions. Hegel, like Aristotle, believes that ethics has an inescapably social dimension. There are certain rules, but you cannot simply stay on the level of rules, because rules do not enforce themselves, if you will. So how we learn to apply these rules cannot be a matter of learning rules, something which would obviously lead to an infinite regress. Rules for applying rules, for applying rules, for applying rules, etc., etc., etc. Instead, we learn the know-how. The word that you use here is knack for apply, and this is, I think, what Aristotle calls phronesis or phronesis. Instead, we learn the knack of applying rules to concrete situations, savvy. how do you say this in Russian? Житейская мудрость. Well, I don't want to say житейская мудрость. It's like you don't learn a rule, you learn the practice. Applying rules to concrete situations through many years of having our moral sensibilities adjusted by the institutions of society. I don't think that we need to pause on this too much about this rule following. But again, the general idea is that the moral sample is empty and it requires the actually existing institutions of society that are products of history in order to complete itself. Anyway, so he said, for example, he says, we're not talking about generosity as such, but certain particular forms of generosity. He says, for example, some societies practice a great deal more generosity towards guests than others do and consider this obligatory. Yeah, so then he can makes an analogy to art, how, in different art forms, unity is not just an abstract principle, but means concrete things, let's say in music, painting, sculpture, drama, or poetry. Yeah. So anyway, so essentially Hegel argues that individuals develop ethically as a result of finding themselves situated within a social whole and realizing their place in relation to others. It is within the social whole that I am led to rise above the narrow concern with satisfaction of personal desires and to become aware of higher duties and obligations. Ethical life is concerned with the three most basic social wholes: family, civil society, and the state. So notice there is no analogy between abstract right morality and ethical life and this another triad: family, civil society, and the state. So which leads me to think that maybe we should not also look at analogies between these things and historical development or historical development of world spirit or psychological development of an individual spirit. So I am sort of warning us against looking for too many analogies between Hegel's triads. I think that we should always begin by assuming that any triad in Hegel is independent from any other triad. Anyway, family is the most basic social institution, headed by a bond of love. In marriage, husband and wife subordinate their individual subjective wills to the good of the marriage and the family they create together. Again, this idea that family life provides some sort of basic idea or experience of membership. This is the reason why marriage is an ethical institution for Hegel. In the sphere, the good is the good of the family. Civil society, where individuals enter into on reaching adulthood, is the antithesis of the family. It is a world characterized not by love, but by competition. By the way, I'm not sure I like the word antithesis here. Okay, this may be one of the signs that we should use Continuum dictionary with care. We know that Hegel, as far as I know, does not use this phrase antithesis, and characteristic synthesis. An antithesis to the family, I think, is maybe slightly misleading. So characterized civil society, bürgerliche Gesellschaft, characterized not by love but by competition. Nevertheless, it is through civil society that individuals acquire a determinate sphere in which they can realize who they are and exercise freedom. People actualize their freedom in civil society principally through the choice of an occupation, and ethical development is made possible by membership in what Hegel calls corporations. So again, remember, so in abstract right, we talked about this narrow Lockean self-destructive society, which is based only on self-interest. And this is not what we're talking about here, because this civil society includes membership in corporations. These are essentially guilds, unions, and professional associations that unite those in certain occupations. Each typically has its own code of ethics, and membership in a corporation encourages cooperation and fellow feeling. It teaches us to see our fellow citizens as something more than competitors. Through participation in civil society, we come to see society itself and its economic arrangement as conditions for the possibility of our freedom. Very important. Again, freedom, always there. Nevertheless, the public spiritedness engendered with civil society is largely motivated by self-interest. There must, Hegel argues, be something in society that binds people together and transcends purely individual concerns. This is the function of the state, which brings people together by embodying the spirit of the nation, its traditions, mores, and customs. In the simplest possible form, the state represents an ethical advance on civil society because it fosters a sense of common citizenship and obligation to the whole. Whereas in civil society, we may feel a bond merely with other members of our corporation. The state unifies the people and safeguards and supports the spheres of family and civil society. In fact, Hegel argues that the very existence of family and civil society presupposes the authority of the state. These Private spheres of relation and action are made possible by a public legal order which overarches, protects, and regulates them. However, Hegel sees the state as much more than just government. The state is objective spirit, which provides a people with a reflection of itself, an embodiment of its cultures and ideas and ideals. Hegel's state is a constitutional monarchy, and the spirit of the people is, in fact, literally embodied in the sovereign. Let's be careful with the word sovereign here, though. Hegel argues in the philosophy of right that freedom is truly realized only through our coming to identify ourselves with a larger social whole. In other words, true freedom only comes about through membership in the state. This does not mean, however, that our particularity is simply cancelled. This is important. Hegel's conception of society makes a place for freedom of choice, individual rights, and the authority of individual conscience. Let's keep this all in mind. In other words, in ethical elements of in the ethical life, elements of abstract right and morality are not destroyed; they are sublated. And this is the translation of the German word Aufhebung, which again popularized by Freud as sublimation. The word Aufhebung, but here the word sublation is used, kind of specialized Hegelian jargon in English language. But again, the German word Aufhebung, which means both cancellation and preservation. And here we mean that important elements of abstract right and morality are preserved in ethical life, such as freedom of choice, individual rights, and elements of negative freedom. For Hegel, freedom must involve willing our determination, affirming the conditions that make true freedom possible, which are more or less the conditions that make possible the society in which we live. Make possible the society in which we live. In one way, of course, these conditions limit us, but in another, more meaningful way, they open up for us a range of possibilities for action which would be denied us if the limitations of society did not exist. Again, and I think an important phrase, and the idea is familiar. We talked about this so many times in how, yes, society imposes certain limits, but actually these limitations, strictly speaking, are not limitations. They are what enable our freedom. People stopping at the traffic light is what makes, which seemingly is a limitation, is what makes traffic possible. Okay, I should be wrapping this up, but let me just briefly look up the article. So there's also an article in Philosophy of Right, and it kind of recaps everything we said so far. And yeah, should I talk about this? I wonder. Well, let's do this very briefly. So Hegel begins in the Philosophy of Right with an attack on idealism in politics. Consider for a moment the philosophy of nature. Wouldn't it have been peculiar if Hegel, in addition to describing the fundamental forms of nature, also legislated the ways in which nature ought to be different? It's a very interesting insight. So the same way that physics professors or biology professors do not tell, physics professors do not tell, bodies how to behave, which laws of motion bodies should follow, and biology professors do not tell organisms how to evolve, but they only observe. In the same fashion, Hegel thinks that professors of political philosophy should first and foremost understand and not understand or interpret and not prescribe. So this would be more peculiar, ridiculous even, because nature is a product of forces beyond our control, and it is futile to try and think of how nature could be otherwise. Wouldn't it be much wiser to try and see some inherent reason or wisdom in the nature and the way it is? So understanding why things are the way they are in nature and therefore in society. This is, of course, precisely the approach Hegel takes with nature, and surprisingly, he takes exactly the same approach with the human world of society and the state. For Hegel, it makes absolutely as much sense to critique society as it does to critique nature. The human world, the world of spirit, has its laws too. It is the task of a philosopher to discern what laws are, not how to legislate new ones. Now, I think this is maybe slightly a more conservative reading of Hegel. I mean, Hegel has conservative, but he also has liberal and reformist and progressive elements. So one should not overdraw this, okay? So it's like, be careful with these formulations. They obviously relate to Hegel, but I think one has to be careful. Human society, as we know it, is a product of 1,000 years of historical evolution, in which there may be profound wisdom at work. In its sheer hubris, Hegel believes sorry, it is sheer hubris, Hegel believes, to look at this product and to reject it, dreaming of something better. Infamously, Hegel states, what is rational is actual. What is actual is rational. The actual is an expression of idea, and as a result of the actual, the actual comes more and more to be recognizable expression of the rational working of itself. Sorry, it's complicated. The actual is an expression of idea, and as a result, the actual comes more and more to be a recognizable expression of the rational working itself out in time, or rationality working itself out in time. It is up to us to discern the inherent rationality in what is. Further, Hegel tells us that philosophy always comprehends its own time and cannot overstep its time. However, Hegel believes that his own time was unique because in certain historical and philosophical trends had reached the natural conclusion, and that an absolute as opposed to relative truth can now be discerned. Again, I think a very valuable article in all sorts of ways. I don't want to necessarily read all of it, but yeah. So what does Hegel mean by right? This notion that right is somehow synonymous with justice, maybe. And in the introduction, Hegel tells us that the idea of right is freedom. So again, we restate the crucial importance of freedom. Anyway, and Hegel is careful to tell us that true freedom does not mean what he calls arbitrary will, doing whatever one likes. This amounts to allowing ourselves to be led by our passions. But passions are not things I have freely chosen. So actually, arbitrary will is not freedom, but it's opposite, if you want. Nor does freedom simply mean lack of constraint. Whoops. Yeah, so nor does freedom simply mean lack of constraint. Many things constrain me, both aspects of myself and the society in which I live. Freedom as lacking constraint simply does not exist. For Hegel, true freedom consists in affirming or willing the ways in which we are determined. I may not have any control over the constraints placed on me by society, but if I can come to understand the reasons behind these things and ways in which they make me and the sphere of my action possible, then in a way they become mine. Having made them mine in this fashion, I remove the sense of being constrained or oppressed by them. Oddly enough, true freedom for Hegel thus consists in choosing to accept our determination, For him, we must identify with the world in which we find ourselves or feel forever oppressed by it. Now, well, this is kind of all the usual caveats. I don't want to necessarily go into this. So then J. Magee continues by talking about this three major sections: abstract right, morality, and ethical life, three major spheres. We see how the will comes to determine itself, or allows itself to be determined in a progressively more and more adequate forms. So, if you want forms adequate to a human being, like fully formed human being. To put it in a different way, in these sections, Hegel treats different dialectically related ways of conceiving the sphere of right, culminating in a fully adequate conception, or justice, if you want. So the development of human nature, or human freedom, or justice. What follows is a very brief account of the argument of philosophy of right, each of the major divisions treated under separate entries. So abstract right is essentially the classical liberal view, society founded upon contract, made for the benefit of individuals who are each pursuing their own self-interest. In a society founded upon abstract right, the primary relations between individuals outside the family are property relations, and government exists to protect property. We talked about this already. So abstract right, the most primitive form in which freedom expresses itself, the claim that this is mine. The trouble with such society is that there's nothing really that binds people together aside from self-interest, nothing that creates a true sense of community. It is through Hegel's discussion of wrong that we actually discover how the dialectic passes beyond this kind of right. So we talked about this already. This is kind of a recap. Wrong or injustice typically involves coercion of some kind, which amounts to a refusal to recognize others as rights-bearing individuals ourselves. The fundamental contradiction brings to light something positive, a universal principle of right or justice. It is out of a recognition of this principle, in fact, that we demand wrongdoers be punished. Yeah, so Hegel's discussion of punishment is one of the most famous parts of the philosophy of right. Punishing wrongdoers in the name of right, however, requires impartial judges based on universal principles. But in the sphere of abstract right, we concern ourselves with the rules for purely selfish reasons. Hegel therefore argues that abstract right cannot be self-sufficient, so we need to go to the moral standpoint. So in morality, again, Hegel uses the term in a special sense. We look to conscience, feelings, sentiments, or abstract moral principles we have derived ourselves or chosen autonomously, a further form in which freedom realizes itself. But how precisely is the subject supposed to derive principles from his or her inwardness? Hegel's discussion of morality is a profound critique of ethical theories such as Kant's, which base morality on abstract rules legislated by individual conscience or reason. The dialectic turns, therefore, from morality to ethical life. Hegel's account of ethical life shows that what ethics requires, in fact, is a social setting in which individuals are tutored in concrete moral traditions and in which their faculty of moral judgment is honed and refined. Essentially, Hegel argues that individuals do not learn to be ethical through the absorption of abstract rules. Instead, they develop ethical attitudes as a result of finding themselves situated within a social whole and realizing their place vis-a-vis others. In other words, it is within a social whole, in my relation to others, that I am led to rise above a narrow concern with the satisfaction of my personal impulses and desires and to become aware of higher duties and obligations. Ethical life for Hegel has three moments, which constitute the three most basic such social wholes: the institutions of family, civil society, and the state. The family, this is simplest. Children leave home, enter what Hegel calls civil society, business world. So membership in corporations. Through participation in civil society, we come to see society itself as a condition for the possibility of our freedom. Through participation in civil society, we come to see society itself as a condition for the possibility of our freedom. Under the heading of administration of justice, Hegel deals with how disputes over property or violations of property rights are protected in civil society. Here, Hegel discusses how civil society promulgates certain basic principles of justice, such as the idea that everyone is equal before the law. The public spiritedness engendered by civil society, however, is motivated largely by self-interest, so we need to move beyond. So the state not only unifies people, it safeguards and supports the sphere of family and civil society. These are more or less private spheres and are made possible by a public legal order which protects and regulates them. Anyway. So Hegel stated constitutional monarchy. The role of the monarch, as he conceives it, is simply to be the final authority. The king is advised by his officials, and his job is to make the recommendations, the policy of the state. Should there be a disagreement among the officials, it is the king who decides. Such a decider is a practical necessity, and Hegel believes that society needs to see the spirit of the nation embodied in a single personality. The simplest and most unproblematic way to select such an individual is through hereditary succession. Aside from the role of the sovereign, Hegel also discusses the executive branch of the government, which includes the judiciary. Public opinion has its say in the legislative branch, so Hegel tells us wisely that the state must both respect and distrust public opinion. Interesting. Yeah, Hegel does say this. Respect and distrust public opinion. Both. Because people should be listened to, but people should not always be listened to because people do not necessarily know what is the best thing to do. Hegel's legislature consists of two houses. The upper house consists of landed aristocracy, and the lower house essentially made up of representatives of business class. So philosophy of right ends with a sketch of international relations and of world history. If we ask how different states or different nations exist in relation to one another, Hegel asserts that they exist in a state of nature. Hobbesian state of nature, probably. Because there's no authority, no world government to which the individual states are subject, their relationships are fundamentally lawless. As a result, so Hegel is a kind of realist, I would say. As a result, periodic conflicts are inevitable. However, Hegel does not see war as unqualifiedly bad. States, like individuals, have a lifespan. Wars often have the effect of ending outworn ways of life or societal structures. Wars also galvanize people and cause them to feel a greater sense of national solidarity. History for Hegel reveals the coming into being of the modern state, which recognizes the inherent dignity and rights of all individuals, making a place for public opinion to speak its mind while never losing sight of the fact that citizens must be educated and guiding in making sound judgments. the ideal form of the state is displayed in the philosophy of right. Hegel's state is not identical with any form of government existing in his time. So one has to be careful when one makes this claim, but I do think that this claim is right. So Hegel's state is not identical with any form of government existing in his time, though here and there it bears similarities to many. It is completely false and ridiculous to say, as some have, that it is simply a carbon copy of the Prussian state under which Hegel was then living and working. Instead, Hegel's state is an ideal which has revealed itself in the modern world, and the modern where Western states are approximations to it. It is not an ideal like Plato's city in the Republic or like Marx's communist utopia. It is an ideal that is embodied in one degree or another in different places. So although Hegel says that physicists and biologists should not legislate for nature, sort of how does he justify his own ideal? And the justification is basically by saying that Hegel is not imagining something beyond the world in which we live, but is simply, taking ideals which are immanent, if you want, in our present contemporary situation. And so it's like a doctor who looks at 10 sick patients and describes an ideal of health, not some kind of just random arbitrary imagination, but actually taken from real existing living individuals. Not to mention that, again, there's this interesting problem with the end of history, but Hegel does think that this ideal that we now see in our modern life is uniquely self-sufficient, which means that we have reached the end of history. This development has reached its logical conclusion, namely the possibility of reaching what Hegel, I think, calls absolute freedom. Like basically the resolution of the conflict between the individual and society. Okay, I'm sure there's more to be said about this, but this has already been going on for too long. So let me stop here, and hopefully this was useful.